All right, making sure I can see the chat as well. Okay, we are at the top of the hour and we have 16 participants. I did hear that we had more than 50 register. So I think I might give us 1 more minute to let people get signed in before we begin. Thanks for your patience and thank you for being here. And the screen share looks okay, correct? Okay, great. Okay, well, I'm seeing 1 minute past the top of the hour. I imagine more people will join, but I think we should go ahead and get started so we have time to talk about all the interesting things we'll be talking about and hearing from our panel today. So welcome everyone to the Copyright and Fair Use panel hosted by the DOLS discussion group. My name is Chelsea, she, her pronouns, and I am one of the co-chairs of the DOLS discussion group this year. And so we're really excited to be presenting this panel today. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 3 panelists. If I can advance the slides, that will work. All right, so today we are joined by Caitlin McKenzie Mannion, Head of Reference and Instruction Services and Arts and Humanities Libraries at Shanghai, New York University. We are also joined by Sarah Norris, Scholarly Communication Librarian at the University of Central Florida. And we are joined as well by Jennifer Shimada, Senior Director of Library and Instructional Media at Relay Graduate School of Education. Welcome to our 3 panelists. Welcome to everyone else. I will share this link again, but I'm going to put it into the chat now, a feedback form for those attending today. I would love if you have a chance at the end, anytime after the panel ends later, to fill out any or all of those brief questions in that. I will share that again at the end, but just in case people want to pop that up on their browser right now, there is that link. Okay. And before we dive into it, just a brief disclaimer. The panelists in this presentation, of course, are not giving any legal advice. This is for informational purposes only, today's presentation. They're not lawyers, they are librarians. So they have wonderful information to share, but it's not legal advice. Okay, I think we shall get into the actual presentation. Copyright and fair use in brief. I will hand it over to Jennifer.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of copyright and fair use, and we'll integrate the questions a lot of folks submitted throughout the presentation, but thought that giving some background would be good context for the question. So on the next slide, we'll start with why does copyright matter? It's a law that goes all the way back to the Constitution. And was intended to promote science and art by allowing authors and inventors to have the right to exclude others from reproducing or distributing the works, preparing derivative works, or publicly displaying or performing their works. So on the next slide, copyright protects any original works that are fixed in any tangible medium of expression. This is automatic, so you don't have to register a work with the US Copyright Office, or have a copyright symbol in order for a work to be copyrighted. On the flip side, works that are not copyrighted on the next slide. So as we saw, copyright requires that the work has a fixed tangible expression. This means that ideas are not copyrightable. If you write down your idea, then that text is copyrighted, but the idea itself is not. Copyright also requires that there is some amount of creativity and originality. So facts, data, and processes are not copyrightable. They might be protected under other laws. Copyright is meant to promote creativity and not hinder the spread of knowledge. So if you could copyright, say, facts, that would be a problem. There are also some works that are not protected by copyright for other reasons, such as work in the public domain. Copyright is not meant to last forever, so that you can have new ideas over time. And so copyright does expire. So on the next slide, that brings me to the first question that was submitted. This question is asking whether theories are considered to be protected by copyright. So the theory or the ideas itself, like I just said, are not protected by copyright, but the expression of those theories may be. So just the idea itself is not, but the article that the theory is written in is protected by copyright. This is important because fair use, which I'll talk about in a second, protects commentary and criticism. So you should be able to talk about these theoretical frameworks and models. One note that I will mention, we aren't really talking about trademark law today, but some words, phrases, or logos might be protected by trademark law. I'm an a graduate school of education. We run into things like this for things like universal design for learning, which is a trademark of CAST. And so we just have to be careful of trademark law there. So some tips for this, provide a citation for the original theory. When it comes to trademark law, you have to be really clear that you are not affiliated with, sponsored by, or endorsed by, say, CAST for Universal Design for Learning, unless you are authorized to do that. And remember that the expression of those theories and frameworks is copyrighted, so quote no more of the original article than you need to. If there's an image or a table or a graphic within that, try to avoid using that without permission because those are often copyrighted separately from the article. So using an entire image or table may not be a fair use. So on the next slide, speaking of fair use, reusing existing cultural and scientific material can be a really important part of generating new research and culture, which is the whole point of copyright. So the law provides a safety valve on copyright that is called fair use. Fair use is a really flexible law that does not have defined boundaries, and it applies to a wide range of activities and materials. It is meant in particular to protect criticism and commentary, news reporting, scholarship, and teaching. But there might be other uses that are fair uses, and just because your use is, say, educational in nature does not necessarily mean that it's a fair use. So I often get people who are really confused by fair use or who really don't like having to think through it, and it is confusing, but the whole point is that it's a little more vague so that it is flexible and responsive. And as part of that, there's not an exact amount or limit to how much of a text that you or any other created work that you can use. Some institutions might make percentage recommendations, like a 10% rule. So you can use 10% of a book or article, but not more than that. So you should definitely be aware of the policies that your institution has set and their interpretation of the fair use law. But on the next slide, I am going to go through what the law actually says. So if it doesn't say you can use 10% of this material, what does it say? And according to copyright law, there are 4 factors that you have to, or that you can use to determine whether a use is a fair use. The first is the purpose and character of the use. How are you using the work? Nonprofit educational uses are more likely to be fair, though, like I said, they aren't necessarily fair. And what is called transformative uses are more likely to be fair. So if you're using the work for a purpose other than that it was originally intended to be used for, that is more likely to be a fair use. Second is the nature of the copyrighted work. What work are you using? If it's a work that is factual and published, it's more likely to be a fair use than a work that is creative or unpublished. Third is the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So how much of the work are you using? In general, you should use as little as possible to achieve your purpose. So if you need just a paragraph, don't use the entire chapter. And the amount that you should use should not necessarily replace the entire sale of the book. There is a concept called the heart of the work. And so if you're using the most important piece of the work, even though it's just a small piece, that is less likely to be a fair use. And finally, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. This is where things like password protecting sites or limiting access only for students while they're in a course becomes important. If you have fewer people with access for a limited time, there is less of an effect on the market for the work than if you were to just post it publicly accessible on a website. I went through all of that really quickly. I could do an entire hour-long presentation or more on fair use, but wanted to give an overview before I went into a couple of the questions. I do want to note that all 4 of those factors need to be considered when determining whether the use of a work is fair. There are checklists that can help you consider all 4 factors. I think Caitlin might put a few of those into the chat. But note that it is an overall determination and not a simple calculation. The law is really vague in order to be more flexible. So on the next slide, that brings us to one of 2 questions that are related to fair use that were submitted to us for this panel. This question asked about posting a scanned copy of an article to a password protected course page. Some disclaimers here. You should use your institution's copyright policy. Fair use is open to interpretation, and some institutions have policies that clearly lay out how they interpret the law. For example, some institutions say you can put up 1 article for 1 semester, but you can't do multiple articles from the same publication or repeated use of the article semester over semester. So if your institution has policies like that, you should be sure to follow those. That said, as we've learned, the law itself is not that clear cut. And there are not percentages or specific rules listed. So I'm going to use this as an example to help us walk through those 4 factors. But again, use your institution's copyright policy if it exists. And this is not legal advice, just an example for educational purposes. So first, the purpose and character of the use. So this faculty member is using it for a nonprofit educational use, which helps. Just make sure that there is what ACRL says is a clear articulable nexus between the instructor's pedagogical purpose and the content involved. So if there's another article that's in the library that would work just as well, it would probably be better to use the other article. But if this article is like the article that is the best one to demonstrate this, then it is more likely to be a fair use. Second, nature of the copyrighted work. This work is published and it's a factual work and not a really creative one, so that weighs in favor. Third, amount and substantiality of the portion used. The whole article is being used here, but it is a small percentage of the entire issue. If you can use less than the whole article, that would be ideal, but otherwise, I would just say avoid using multiple articles from the same journal in the same course where possible, because that would be a greater percentage of the issue. And yes, like I said, if you can use less than the full article, like a paragraph or so, that would be better. And finally, the effect of the use on the potential market. So if there's a licensing mechanism, a way to pay copyright fees for this article, that does weigh against. As does if you are using this article for multiple semesters, because that just is a greater number of students who get access to this, which is a greater effect on the potential market. On the flip side, it is in a password protected LMS. It's only available during that course, so that weighs in favor. The instructor should make sure that they lawfully acquired the material, which they did in this case, but should double check that there are no terms of use where they got the article to make sure that there isn't a term of use that prevents sharing that article. And it will also help if you provide a written notice to students saying that the work is protected by copyright and they should not distribute it or reproduce it unless their use is also a fair use, because that will hopefully help dampen the effect on the potential market than if students were to distribute that article widely. So overall, I would say that putting a single article from a journal on a password protected site generally falls under fair use, as long as there's a clear pedagogical reason why you're using it and you're not using a lot of articles from the same journal. Again, refer to your institution's copyright policy, but I would say this is pretty clearly a fair use if you were in my institution. On the second slide, let's look at another example. So this person submitted a question about an instructor filming herself reading children's books and posting them to a LibGuide. Again, this is just how I might walk through the 4 factors. Somebody else could look at this in a different way. But I'm going to start with the 2 factors where this example likely fails fair use. So first is the nature of the copyrighted work. Storybooks are really creative, and so that weighs against, although the fact that they are published does weigh for. And the amount and substantiality of the portion used. If you're reading the entire book, especially if you're showing both the text and the pictures, that does weigh against, and if you were just reading a brief excerpt of the book. The other 2 factors might weigh in favor, but it really does depend. So one downside of this proposal, when you're looking at effect of the use on the potential market, is that LibGuides are usually publicly available. So it would be better if the instructor could put this on a password protected site. The other thing to consider is whether this, why they're using this. So is this going to promote the book or substitute for the purpose of the book, and therefore discourage students from buying the book? You could argue that recording yourself and posting that online is not a substitute for the physical book. Like people would still need to go buy the physical book. They aren't using those for the same purposes. You could maybe argue that it was substituting for an audiobook, but probably not. People are generally not going to listen to the librarian instead of buying an audiobook. They'll just buy the audiobook. Copyright expert Carrie Russell has argued pretty convincingly, in my opinion, that online story time is a different thing than an audiobook. And so that if you were a public librarian and doing online story time, I'm putting a link into the chat, that would be a fair use. But that does bring me to the last one, the same slide. Sorry, back. Thanks. The last factor, though, is this an online story time? Why does the instructor want to record themselves reading children's books? So what is the purpose and character of their use? It is a nonprofit educational use, which helps, but is there a pedagogical purpose for reading the children's book? And is this the only way to achieve that purpose? If the instructor is only doing this so that the students don't have to buy the book, that would be a problem. But if the instructor is modeling, for example, how a prospective teacher should do a read aloud in their classroom, that could be a valid pedagogical purpose. And it would be even better if, like, every once in a while, the instructor stops reading and asks the pretend class questions to model how a teacher might do that. That becomes a more transformative use instead of just reading the book like you would read it to children for the same purpose that it was created to be. The instructor would be actually using that book to show teachers how to teach with children's books, which is a different purpose than the book was originally created for. So in this example, the nature of the copyrighted work and the amount and substantiality of the portion used weighs against fair use. The other 2 might weigh for it. So where do we land? Some factors might weigh more heavily than others, and I would say this really depends. If you can put the videos on a password protected LMS, that would be much better. But if not, be sure that the instructor is really clear about why they are reading these books and putting them online, and is there a really clear pedagogical purpose? Which brings me to my last slide. Just a reminder that educational uses are not always fair uses. I just gave an example of doing a 4-factor fair use analysis. It does get a little bit complicated. I would say don't stress too much. There is laws that are in favor of educators that as long as you are trying in good faith to follow fair use and not just blatantly disregarding copyright, you don't have a lot of liability. And so I would just keep these general factors in mind of considering your purpose, making sure that you're using the work for a purpose other than it was originally intended to be, if possible. Limit access to materials and provide attribution. And if you are doing those things, your use is much more likely to be fair. So try to learn more about fair use, but as long as you're keeping those principles in mind, you are probably okay. So I'm going to pass the mic to Caitlin, who's going to talk more about online classes.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about copyright and how that fits into the online classroom. But first, I'm also going to do a little bit of a flyover of what's in our US copyright code. So Chelsea, if you want to click the first part, and again, sorry, one more time, Chelsea, the relevant sections that I'm going to talk about. The first thing is all of this is contextualized under what are actually the exclusive rights of copyright holders. So the obvious one is the right to reproduce or make a copy of a copyrighted work. But there are other exclusive rights that copyright holders are entitled to, and that includes to prepare derivative works. That includes making translations of materials or like adapting a novel into a film. Distribution of copyrighted works to the public by sale, rental, lease, lending. Now, this is something that is exhausted by first sale, which is why libraries get to do what we do. And it also includes things like public performance of a literary work, of a musical work, of a motion picture, public display, or digital audio transmission performances of sound recordings. And so to clarify the difference between a public performance and public display, so to perform would mean to recite, to render, to play, to dance, to act, either directly or by means of a device. Whereas to publicly display, we're kind of thinking more about works of art, the right of an artist to decide if their artwork is going to be displayed in a gallery or not. And so to understand what you can do with the exemptions in copyright law, it's important to think about what are the rights of the copyright holders in the first place that we're getting these exemptions to. And so that takes us to section 107, which is fair use. And that's what Jennifer just very helpfully explained. So this has been explained in great detail, and that's part of what makes US copyright law so unique. We actually have a very, very flexible, broadly construed approach to copyright law that really sets our copyright system apart from many other systems that are out there. Fair use is designed to be beyond definition, despite it is one of the most frequently covered questions in copyright law cases brought to court. It's the issue that's most frequently debated. And so that's part of why these fair use factors are described in an illustrative way. It is not an exhaustive list. That's why they've really avoided putting any percentages on how much is permissible to copy and still be within fair use. So fair use is the sort of thing that allows you to do things like make reproductions of a copyrighted work, like for multiple copies for classroom use. But if we then move on to section 110, and specifically section 110, chapter 2, this is the exemption of certain performances and displays. So section 110.1 is what permits the performance or display of a work in the course of face-to-face teaching. So face-to-face teaching is something that we're all familiar with, and this is a very broad, very generous exemption, but it doesn't map equally to distance education or the online classroom. And so that's where section 110.2 comes in. And this deals with the limitations of certain types of works in the course of what they say are mediated instructional activities or transmissions. So this was fully reworked as part of the Teach Act of 2002. There are certain things that it doesn't apply to. So, if we're dealing with educational materials that were created for an online classroom, pay educational video tutorials, these would not be exempted, for example. This does apply to the performance of non-dramatic, literary, or musical works, or a reasonable or limited portion of another work or display of a work in an amount comparable to what would be displayed in a face-to-face class. So that's okay, but it's only if this display is made under the direction of an instructor. It's of material assistance to the teaching content itself, and it's solely for the use of the students enrolled in that class, and for people as part of the regular course of those duties. So what you really have are these responsibilities to communicate copyright law and to your users, to promote compliance amongst your users, give notice and make sure that the students and the faculty know who is the copyright holder of these movies, these audiovisual works or literary works that are being performed or displayed in an online class. There's also, to a certain extent, section 112F, and this deals with ephemeral recordings. This doesn't apply as much, but I did just want to mention this briefly, that this is also an exception available to us. So I want to move now into these questions of what can you do with films? Films tend to be a big question of what you can do in the online classroom. And if you're thinking of displaying a film in your online class, or if you're working more realistically, if we're working with instructors who want to display films in their online classes, you've probably noticed that section 110.2 really only specifically allows for the performance of non-dramatic literary or musical works, or limited reasonable portions of other works. So fair use might not help you here, especially if what you want to screen is a full film, especially if it's a feature film, because it's not really transformative enough. Although it's true that no one factor is more important than another. What you might do is think about how you can use this as a teaching opportunity with faculty, to either direct them to streaming platforms that already have public performance licenses packaged in, or work with offices of legal and compliance to get streaming license rights for these films. We don't automatically have the right to reformat media from a physical format to a digital format. So if this is something that you want to pursue, you would really have to go through the full fair use analysis. And this is something that, you can have help with. I think the biggest takeaway from any copyright training or backgrounds or webinars is really to realize that it's not a one librarian project. You have allies within your library and within your university system who are there to help guide you through these questions, these fair use analyses, but also to advocate for you in negotiating with copyright holders so you can do what you want to do with these things. So do reach out to either your scholarly communications librarian or your legal office. Liaise with studios to request streaming rights or permissions or reformatting permissions. The next point is to point out this difference between licensed and owned materials. So it's always great if you can link to materials that you have through online databases. This is a very low risk activity to do when you're using materials that you have. But you should bear in mind that the materials that you own physically, you can do a lot with those physical objects, with those tangible materials because of the first sale doctrine. But the materials that you have in a streaming database, or e-journals or ebooks, these are licensed. And so those contracts will supersede a lot of these elements of copyright law. So there might be restrictions that are placed on what you can do with these materials that's baked into the contract. So I would really recommend paying very close attention to those licensing contracts. So this is where I think having a checklist strategy is very useful. There are some great checklists out there. I see that Jennifer has helped to put those in the chat. I recommend working on having a checklist for your benefit, but also for the faculty or students that you're working with to help guide you through the process of determining what you can do with these materials in your online classroom. I think that the Kansas State one, I personally really like that one because they have checklists for both dramatic and non-dramatic works, and they include definitions. So this is an opportunity to educate your users on what they can and cannot and should or should not do with these copyrighted materials. And I think the next slide is still me, because this is where we move on to a specific question that we received on have you employed controlled digital lending or CDL in any of your online classes. So I want to start just by reviewing a little bit of background on what CDL is. CDL, also called digitize and lend programs, it's still a pretty new theory. It's only been around for the past decade or so. It's mostly bolstered and supported by arguments of fair use, but there are some theoretical applications of the library's exception and the first sale doctrine as well to this. But this is still taking its final form as it is. And it's this theory of taking an object, taking a book that you own, so you own the tangible text of that book, and making a digitized copy of that book and taking the tangible book, placing it in cold storage so the book cannot be physically checked out. And so you're maintaining an owned to loaned ratio so that you're only circulating that digitized copy of the ebook, and you have implemented protections on that book to safeguard against downloading or printing or reproducing that copy, the same way that we would put copyright notices on our printers and printing machines in our libraries to educate our users that they shouldn't be making full-scale photocopies of the books that we have. So the applications of CDL, in terms of this specific question, I think what's important to remember is CDL more appropriate for instructional use? Is it more appropriate for personal research? We want to be mindful of the access issues that are involved with CDL when we are maintaining this idea of an owned to loaned ratio. So if you have one physical book, you've made that scan, only one digital file can be circulated in lieu of the tangible book. So that means only one person can be consulting it at a time, the same as with a print book. And this could be very challenging to use that in a pedagogical context, because if you have a classroom with more than one student, but you only have one digital file, you're going to have the same access issues as if you were relying on a physical book. So this is a time to, again, advise our faculty users on CDL's uses for pedagogical and course reserves, as opposed to just purchasing print or digital textbook materials. So thinking about what someone's actually going to want to do with that CDL object. So this is the difference really between CDL and our conventional ebooks. A lot of applications of CDL will pretty much be, you can just read it on that screen. There are no internal links. There's no highlighting option. There's no printing, or if there is printing, it's pretty limited. Whereas these ebooks, which we've licensed through our ebook platforms, these tend to have more options of linking or downloading, printing, highlighting. But these ebooks will be guided by contract law and the licenses that you have signed. So in your making the decision to choose to use CDL or not, this, again, it's a group effort, and it's a group decision within your library. And this is a time to advocate for your users and their needs, to work with the scholarly communications teams or your Office of Legal and Compliance, and consider advocating for CDL in your library, depending on how do we say, how tolerant of risk your legal office is. They may be more or less supportive of bringing in CDL. They're more likely to be a bit more conservative, but that you can advocate for incorporating this as another library service that you are providing to your users. But it is useful and interesting to pay attention to precedent. So a lot of what's happening with CDL is built on cases like, Google Books and HathiTrust, and the HathiTrust Emergency Temporary Access Service is a very interesting sort of proof of concept. And right now there is a case, Authors Guild versus Internet Archive, which is an interesting counterpoint to those that precedent of Google Books and HathiTrust. But I really encourage you to think about the uses of CDL because it is going to be very contextual based on user needs. Individual research tends to be a little bit easier because it is one person reading that text as opposed to many students sort of trying to vie for access to a single digital file simultaneously, because they might not understand why these limitations have been placed on a CDL file. So understanding our users' circumstances. And again, this is a great opportunity to be an advocate for open access or OER materials to our faculty, especially if they are teaching in an online classroom. So I think that this is my opportunity to pass the baton on.
Thank you, Caitlin. And yeah, I think there's so many things that we're talking about today that really foundational, these case by case and contextual things that we do want to think about when we're looking at specific questions from our faculty, or even for us as we are doing online instruction. So as we cap out the formal presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the last questions that we received in advance. So the first one, how does linking to a resource versus embedding a resource affect copyright? And this is a really great question because it brings up the difference between uploading versus linking versus embedding. Those are all different kinds of things that we're going to be doing in an online course. And so Jennifer did talk a little bit about uploading. So this idea of taking a resource from its existing website or where it lives online and downloading that and then re-uploading that to our learning management system. And so in that case, those are going to be scenarios where we do look more at licensing, as both Jennifer and Caitlin mentioned, as well as copyright and maybe a fair use analysis. But linking and embedding are slightly different in that what we're doing there is we are either using a URL to direct our students or even faculty to a resource online, and that can include something just on the web. It can include something from our library license databases, streaming video, and then embedding. Embedding is really taking that information, usually a URL, and using a technological mechanism within our learning management system to sort of make that visible in the learning management system so the students don't have to click a link and go to an external site. A lot of times we do this with video in particular, where that video is there and they can just click play. And so that's one option there. But how do we navigate copyright with that? What are the copyright challenges or things that we need to be thinking of? So with linking and embedding, I think kind of the key thing, and of course, this is a caveat of always, it depends, right? Because we want to look through all of these critically and mindfully. But typically when we're thinking about linking to an external resource or even embedding that external resource into a learning management system, or even on a LibGuide or other places, it's usually not going to be considered a copyright violation or challenge. And that's because it is that technology mechanism, right? We're directing someone to the original source, the existing place where that is online. So we're not distributing or duplicating the work. Of course, there are always caveats to this, and we do want to be really critical and mindful. I always sort of joke with our faculty and even librarian colleagues that your spider senses will tingle if you are looking to share a resource that you found, maybe a video on YouTube, maybe it's a full feature-length film that you found on YouTube. If it's not from the original source, right, we probably know that that's not going to be the authorized version, the copyright legitimate version of that source. So, using double checking mechanisms to make sure that whatever you want to link to or whatever you want to embed in the online course is going to be copyright compliant, that there are no challenges. And of course, as Caitlin mentioned, asking others that have expertise for assistance, whether it's someone with scholarly communication or copyright expertise in your library, general counsel when relevant, but also other people on campus. Maybe you have access to instructional designers. You don't have to do these or know all these things on your own. Really doing a team approach can be very helpful when you're looking at resources to determine if something's going to be okay or not okay to share. So always look for those helpers, as Mr. Rogers would say. So moving on to the next question, how do copyright rules differ in synchronous and asynchronous courses? And this is a really great question because I think what it prompts is, how do we understand the tools that we're going to use or create for our online courses? And that really dictates the ways in which we understand and navigate copyright. So whether we're teaching asynchronously or asynchronously, a lot of times those copyright considerations are going to be the same. It just really depends, again, on that case-by-case contextual content or resource that you want to use for online teaching. So whether it's you or a faculty member, asking some of those questions. What is it that you want to share? Are you uploading content? Are you embedding or linking that content? To Caitlin's point about video, are you showing that live? What are the things that we need to think through there? Would a video be better viewed asynchronously if we give that link that we talked about? That can help also mitigate licensing challenges with some licensed resources that we have online through our library. That can be a helpful thing. Are you giving a presentation, and do you need to consider fair use with the images that you use in that presentation? Certainly anything pre-recorded. And again, those library licensed content, whether it's an ebook or a journal, making sure that when the license indicates that we need to link to that content versus downloading and then re-uploading that to our learning management system, those are going to be some nuances that we want to think through. And then, of course, always keeping accessibility in mind. So it's that sort of twofold of making sure that we are copyright and licensing compliant, but then also making sure that we think about accessibility for any kinds of content that we want to share, both synchronously and asynchronously, to make sure that that's accessible. And then moving into the last question that we had. So this was, I think, kind of a multi-faceted question, and a really good one because it is tricky. I always joke that I do sound like a lawyer because I say it depends, because the ways in which we approach not only, understanding and making judgments on copyright for instruction, whether it's face-to-face or online, is different. And that also applies to the ways in which we navigate copyright in our instruction that we give, right? How much do we include? What do we include? That can always be very tricky. So we'll try to unpack a little bit of that. So the first things that we want to think about, if you can go ahead to the next slide, Chelsea, is some considerations. And, the ways in which we do copyright in our instruction is, of course, going to depend on a lot of factors. And so what I thought might be more helpful, and I would certainly love to hear both from my colleagues as well as those of you who are attending in the chat, things and strategies that you have come up with. But I thought an environmental scan is a really helpful strategy. Thinking about your own personal considerations will help you navigate how much, how little, and what kind of copyright information you share in your instruction. So I think key piece of the considerations, of course, what are your faculty and instructor needs? Is a faculty member asking you to do that instruction and you are providing information where copyright information and guidance might be relevant? And certainly the topic, I think this is the key one. What is it that you are providing the instruction on? I'm a scholarly communication librarian, so a lot of times my instruction is fully focused on copyright. And yet I also give instruction on general library resources, maybe a literature review workshop. And so the type of topic I have will dictate how much or what kind of copyright information I might share. And equally, your role, of course, is going to be critical. So if you are maybe a liaison or a subject librarian, the ways in which you do instruction, maybe peppering in some copyright information, maybe students are giving a presentation and you're helping them through that process, talking a little bit about copyright and making sure that the images you create and share in your presentation are copyright compliant would be a great time to put that in your instruction. Time is always a consideration. It's never on our side, right? Even today, Jennifer mentioned we could talk about these topics in depth for a long amount of time. And so if you have a 15-minute one-shot instruction and you've got to include copyright in that, that's going to be really difficult. And so again, where can you find those little nuggets of copyright information that's really relevant to the instruction and to the students who might be in that session? Synchronous versus asynchronous. Gosh, if you can do an asynchronous opportunity, that really gives you that extra time to explore and maybe give a little bit more in-depth information. So utilize that when you can. If you create a research guide or a LibGuide, that's a good place to put some of that. Or if you're embedded in an online learning management system, those are great places to add in more in-depth information that students can refer to. And both Jennifer and Caitlin mentioned institutional policies. If you have copyright policies, if there are things that students and even faculty need to know about, you want to articulate that so it's clear. And also institutional culture. You know, I tend to present to more graduate students and faculty. And so the ways in which I give copyright instruction, or just instruction in general, might be different, but also your institutional culture. How do people like presentations? What's the style? What kind of information do they like to see shared? That's going to also, I think, impact the kinds of the ways in which you can incorporate copyright in your class. So as we move on, we'll look at other approaches and information to include. So again, these are really high level, and I would love to hear suggestions from other folks. But what do you give? How do you give information? I think even us giving this presentation today struggled a little bit. How much background do we give all of you? We're all copyright enthusiasts, so we want to say all the things. We want to tell you all the background. We want to go into those fair use factors. And yet, is that always practical or reasonable, right? So giving people the basics. What do they need to know? And also giving a little bit of background is helpful, but temper that, right? Know your audience, make sure that you aren't going into a deep dive of copyright with undergraduates who just want to do a literature review or are looking to do a presentation, right? We want to keep that minimal. Real world examples work really well. Students and faculty both resonate with those real world examples. If you can show them copyright scenarios that they're going to encounter in everyday life or even pop culture, I find that works really well. That can help them understand some of the academic practices and recommendations we have for copyright. And a strategy that I think is always really helpful too is giving students sort of putting them in the shoes of copyright holders, reminding them that they are not only using copyrighted content in the work they're doing, but they're also creators of copyrighted content. And, you know, sort of this making sure we're modeling good behavior. And usually when we frame it that way, it helps students have that light bulb moment of, yes, I wouldn't want somebody to do this with my materials that I create, so I should also model that good behavior. So that can be a helpful strategy. Of course, we want to give those academic examples as well. And when we can, activities are great. Again, if you can make them fun, interactive, while giving them educational information about copyright, that's super helpful. If it's synchronous or asynchronous, that's going to be a good thing to do. If you are giving synchronous presentations, give those time for questions, which is going to lead into us finishing up very soon, right? Giving people opportunities to explore, to talk through something, to get more information. That's always going to be very helpful. And look for opportunities to follow up. A key takeaway I give in any presentation that I give to students or faculty is, if you remember one thing from the presentation you've gone to today, is know that you can contact a librarian and that we can help you, right? Because it's a lot of information. They don't have to be experts, but to know that there's somebody there that can help them is a really helpful tool to use. So really definitely leverage that as well. Or if you're not the person, you know, give them somebody else that you know within your library or other places for resources as well. And then just kind of wrapping up, looking at some tools and examples. And again, if you have specific things, I would love to hear your ideas. But just in general, utilize your learning management system as much as possible. If the faculty member is open to you utilizing discussion boards or embedding and linking things, those are going to be great spaces for you to provide asynchronous information about copyright that may not be feasible in an instruction, or just may not be feasible if you are not providing any kind of formal presentation, right? You're there to help, you're there to give that faculty member information, but you might not have that formal opportunity for instruction. We talked about research guides, any kind of tool you can use to, again, have this asynchronous content is very helpful. Students can refer to that. I find that the point of need is typically when they're going to look for those pieces of information. So those can be very helpful over time. And then lastly, just as we finish up, again, share your favorite resources. We've shared a few in the chat already with websites, checklists, things that we have found helpful. But if you have tools that you use already, share them with us. We would love to hear it, and I know your colleagues would too. So with that, I think that's the end of the questions for me. And I think we're opening it up to other questions.
Yes, thank you all so much. I learned a lot, have a lot to think about. But this is some time for our attendees to get any questions they have for our three panelists answered. Please feel free to unmute yourself and just speak your question, or if you'd prefer to have it in the chat, I will keep an eye on the chat and can read out a question that anyone posts there. So, and then we can just see who of our three panelists wants to answer first, and maybe the others can join in as well. So I think I will stop sharing just so we can see each other. Does that sound okay? See nods? Okay, great. All right, so yes, any questions that you have?
Hi there, this is Anna Uribe. I was wondering if anyone could speak to, I think it's sort of referred to maybe as like a course packet, sort of. So like, let's say I have a standardized online course. So let's say it's English 125, right? And we use the same required and recommended resources linked from the library in that course in Canvas. But let's say, you know, these required and recommended resources, they're the same for every single section of ENG 125 that is taught. And I know a lot of universities that are going towards having like an online version of a certain program, maybe starting to use these sorts of standardized courses where faculty teach, all faculty teach from the same sort of, you know, master course or what have you. I wonder if anyone could speak to those sort of course packets when you're curating resources from your collections, or maybe even resources outside your collection.
So I think when you're kind of doing this course pack approach, this is with the obvious caveat of making sure that you're familiar with the licenses with those databases that you're subscribing to. If you have licensed those online resources through your databases, and there's not a prohibition on the number of people who can access, say, an article at the same time, that's a great way of mitigating costs for your students, for your users. So, you know, when it comes to the question of linking to resources that are within your collections, you know, and especially odds are, I'm willing to stake the house on this one. Odds are that those are all copyright compliant. They are not pirated copies that you have through your databases. You would want to be a little bit more cautious when using resources outside of your library that you're linking to, because you do want to make sure that you're linking to materials that are stable and that are themselves copyright compliant, because any claim of fair use that you might be trying to make, or any claim for any exemption, is immediately voided if what you're trying to use is itself an infringing copy of a source. But I'll let my colleagues chime in with their insights as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. We do a lot of this, and it's one of my favorite things, because anything you link to, 99% of the time, there are occasionally licenses that restrict it, but most of the time, anything you link to from the library, you can do. And you don't have to worry about paying licensing fees and so on. So it's a great way to increase usage of the library, is by integrating those sources. Be much more careful if you're uploading things or using things outside of the library, but in the library, it is a really great way to give students free resources and increase library usage.
Yes, and I would third that. We do that as well. We always encourage linking as much as possible and relevant, especially utilizing library licensed content. That's always our default.
Thanks for the question, Anna. Any others coming to mind for us? I threw another link to our brief feedback form for those who can take a moment to fill that out when we're finished today. Thank you so much. But we still have a few minutes for questions.
while we're waiting for questions, I'll share it. I really think that this idea of copyright, it can actually be empowering in some interesting ways. This is a true story from my work. Last year, so I was working with an instructor who teaches a contemporary art class, and this instructor wanted to show a video, like a performance piece video that it's not on DVD, it's not available in any form. What she was able to find were a few YouTube videos of uncertain provenance. And where we are based in China, we have our own sort of access issues with online resources. And so we were talking through strategies for getting legally compliant copies of this source that she could display in her class. And so we were just sort of having a chat about what we were dealing with and what the copyright considerations even were. And throughout the course of this conversation, I was saying, if we can get permission from the copyright holder, if they can give us a copy, that would be great. And the instructor just had this aha moment of, oh, I know the gallery that has this film. I know that they work with this artist. And she was able to reach out to the gallery, and they provided a password protected Vimeo link to a legally compliant copy because they had the rights to that. They had the rights to authorize that. And so then she was able to use that video in her class. And it was very easy. Once we hit upon this realization that we know who the copyright owner is, it took one email and it was doable. So it's not some insurmountable task, but it was the sort of thing that only would have happened through this community effort, through this conversation between myself and the instructor. But it is very doable. And so I think that was an exciting moment for me personally.
Just goes to show that, communication and discussing with colleagues on these topics is super important. So thanks for sharing that, Caitlin. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in right now, and I'll give it another moment, but I just greatly appreciated hearing from you all. I learned more about CDL. I learned more about kind of thinking about, it's not always so much about asynchronous versus synchronous in teaching, but about the tools you're using and the resources you're using. So those were some highlights for me. And of course, a fair use refresher is always welcome. So I think this was really valuable. Unless anyone has anything else, we might be able to wrap up a couple of moments early, but I'll give it another pause.
Just want to say thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your expertise. This is such a nuanced area, and so I know I really, really appreciate it. It was some great information you all shared today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, lots of